I still don't think that anybody has found that she was an enormously proactive or powerful individual politically, but she's certainly an interesting woman. She was right at the heart of the Wars of the Roses, and her influence over her husband and children is definitely there. It's just that she wasn't kind of noisy about it. So the other interesting information about her comes from her Privy Purse expenses, which were catalogued in the 19th century and give all sorts of information, unfortunately only about the last year of her life, but give a great picture of what it was like to be a late medieval queen, what she spent her money on, what she did with her time, and so forth. I think she's also been perhaps brought to the forefront by a renewed interest in the Wars of the Roses, because she was very much caught up in that as the daughter of Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville and the sister of the princes in the Tower. So that was one of the reasons we wanted to look at her as Person of the Month. She does bridge that gap between the medieval period and the Tudor period, and it's interesting to think about how somebody's life, obviously she was a member of the House of York, but she married the Lancastrian Henry VII, and many people, she felt she had a better right to the throne than he did, but she never seems to have thought of herself as a queen in her own right. I mean, most women wouldn't have done at the time, but she was very much admired in her own time, very greatly mourned when she died. And, I haven't come across a single negative word about her, actually. She's every account of her is very positive.
So you mentioned the renewed interest in her and the interest in the Wars of the Roses, and a certain historical fiction narrative author and TV series makes it seem like maybe she had a romance going on with a particular Yorkist king before Henry. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, this is a story that actually began in the reign of Richard III himself. So Richard III was her uncle, and there was a story that in early 1485 he was thinking of marrying his niece. Now, and unsurprisingly, that gave rise to a good deal of gossip and unpleasant talk, because, uncles marrying nieces was not considered any nicer then than it is now. And Richard III publicly denied that he'd had any such idea at all. In the late 17th century, no, actually in the early 17th century, an antiquarian called George Buck claimed to have seen a letter written by Elizabeth to the Duke of Norfolk, Richard's friend, insinuating that she was in love with her uncle and wanted to marry him. But the letter itself, no one else has ever seen the letter, and the transcript of it would appear, doctored by George Buck's grandson, another George Buck, who forged a number of letters. The Richard III Society has actually transcribed what appears to have been the first manuscript, and it doesn't, it's capable of a number of interpretations. And personally, I wouldn't have said that the first thing that would leap to my mind would be that she wanted to marry her uncle, but that's one interpretation that's been made of it. The thing is, perhaps she had a crush on her uncle, but he had claimed that her parents lived in adultery, that Elizabeth herself and her siblings were all illegitimate. He had taken the throne of her brother, and whatever happened to the princes in the Tower, they disappeared whilst they were on Richard's watch. Personally, I think it was unlikely that she wanted to marry him, but hey, who knows? I wouldn't have thought most women in that circumstance would suddenly have a crush on him. But
right.
people stay with all sorts of people who are not necessarily ideal partners. But I would have thought that being called illegitimate and having your parents branded adulterers and your brother disappearing, might put you off a bit.
Yeah, it might just a bit. But, interesting.
Yeah, no, it was certainly talked of at the time, but there we go.
Yeah, and if she was illegitimate anyway, it's not as if she would have provided Richard with any greater claim to anything if she
Well,
was branded as
that's
illegitimate.
the tricky question because, you know, Richard claimed that his brother's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was not valid. And there are people who have accepted that claim, both then and since. Legally, the validity of a marriage was a matter for the church courts, and there was never any public airing of the evidence that was supposed to exist, and there was never any church court pronunciation on it. So it was not more than an act of parliament passed by Richard. So I would have thought it unlikely that Elizabeth herself would have thought of her parents' marriage as invalid.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it also, it seems like there's, like you said, this Victorian idea about her. Like there's this stereotype of her that she was just this quiet wife who took care of the children, and like she taught her children them. Like there's this idea that like she taught Henry how to write, and she taught her children personally rather than sending them away, and that she was just this mother and this domestic person. What do you make of all of that? And can you talk a little bit about that?
I think that's probably true in the sense that was a great deal of family affection seems to have been an important facet of her character. She was very close to all of her sisters. She seems to have been attached to her mother and to her children. I think she comes across as a very affectionate and loving woman altogether, and fond of her cousins, her nephews and nieces. Actually a real family person. The idea that she taught her children, I don't know that there's any actual evidence of it. It's been identified as a possibility because of the similarity between her handwriting and that of Henry VIII's, and I think that was the basis. I think Dr. Starkey has hypothesized that Elizabeth did actually teach him, and it was certainly not impossible, though in the next generation, the humanists recommended that mothers should be the first tutors of their children. So it's certainly perfectly possible. She wouldn't have taught Arthur, who, as Prince of Wales, had his own tutors and his own household from a very early age. But she may well have taught the younger ones. The accounts show that, well, in fact, that both parents, both Elizabeth and Henry VII, took a good deal of interest in their children, in their music lessons, in their clothes, in just the general day-to-day parts of life. And her children didn't live with her. They partly because the royal household was tended to be centred at Westminster, which wasn't considered healthy for children. So her children were mostly at Eltham or at Greenwich or Sheen. And Elizabeth travelled quite frequently with Henry VII. They moved about the country a fair bit, and children, it wasn't suitable for young children to be dragged all over the country. But she visited them frequently, and they came to her. So she was probably closer to them than lots of medieval queens were.
And I realized we kind of skipped, like me asking you about Richard and everything like that. We just kind of skipped, and have an assumption here that people will know about who she is. And I realized that's probably a bit remiss of me to skip over that. So can you tell me just a little bit about who she is and, just kind of her life story?
Yeah. Elizabeth was the oldest child of Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville. She was born in 1466 in the Palace of Westminster, and her parents subsequently had another, I think, possibly a dozen children, of whom quite a few lived till adulthood. She was, for her first few years, she was her father's heir because she only had sisters until 1471. But nobody ever thought of her as a potential queen. It was always assumed that Edward would go on to have sons, and he did. In her early youth, she was betrothed to the Dauphin of France as part of a treaty of Picquigny, I think it was, the Treaty of Picquigny between Edward IV and Louis of France. And it was arranged that when she was of marriageable age, which was anywhere after the age of 12, but probably more normally about 14, that she would go to France and become Queen of France. and she was known as Madame la Dauphine at court, and everybody assumed that she would one day be Queen of France. In 1482, about 6 months before he died, Edward IV was absolutely horrified, shocked, and people thought it actually led to a decline in his health when Louis of France broke the marriage off. And effectively, Elizabeth was publicly jilted and humiliated. Not very nice for a young woman who was by that time nearly 18. So at that time, then there was talk of her marrying Henry, Earl of Richmond, as he was considered to be the last Lancastrian heir. But whether Edward IV really intended such a marriage to take place, I think it's fairly unlikely. He was more likely to be putting the idea forward to get Richmond into his hands, to have him, what should we say, out of harm's way. But it would appear that Richmond's mother, Margaret Beaufort, and Elizabeth's mother, Elizabeth Woodville, after Edward IV's death, did put their heads together and decide that a marriage between Elizabeth and Richmond would be the answer to the whole Lancaster-York conflict. And in fact, that is what happened. After Bosworth, Henry and Elizabeth were married in the January of 1486. They went on to have 7 children, probably. There's talk of an 8th, but there's only real evidence of 7. She was crowned as queen in 1487 and was a remarkably popular and successful queen.